at Ascona 2 Group. On this basis, this is what we're here to achieve. And we have made great strides from the beginnings of high-resolution manometry with people like Ray Klaus, building their machines by hand in St. Louis, to the Chicago classification version 4. Really, and this consensus has been established. These publications have been cited more than 3,000 times, and really, there is a solid basis on which we can build here. The Lyon classification as well has been a great success, cited more than 800 times since its publication only in 2018. The London classification wasn't being able to roll out quite in the same way thanks to Corona, but even this has been cited 200 times, and people are beginning to use it and do studies to validate it. And it's a positive step forward, because trust me, I know most of you here are upper GI people. Well, there's plenty to disagree about in the upper GI tract, but that's nothing compared to the anorectal area, I tell you. It took us an hour one day to discuss what urgency meant. From this, a lot of work has flown. Here we see a series of reviews in Nature Gastroenterology, many original papers, good consensus groups. We have gained respect for this previously highly controversial corner of gastroenterology and medicine. And as I implied, looking forward, I'm very much hoping that since in the last few years we've got some agreement on breath tests, European-based at the moment with Utah and with Heinz, and now we're looking to build on this and start a gastric working group, of which I'll talk more in the future, because there's so many technologies available now. But what should we be using, and what does it mean? I think we all agree there's a lot of room for improvement here. So that is why we're here. There are, of course, housekeeping rules. Irene will tell us more about this in just a moment. We are still fitting comfortably into this auditorium. Be aware that there will be times where this 120 seats will not be sufficient. There is a very nice room upstairs, Sala Balint. If you're not particularly focused on the subject in hand, then you can take your laptops and do your emails and listen in the background or socialize with people, talk to the sponsors, and this room is perfect for all of those purposes. I have been told to say, if it gets bright and you want to close the curtain, do not pull on the curtains. Use the pulley system available, otherwise it's very expensive in Switzerland to get that kind of thing wrong. So that's that. Another thing to mention, coffee breaks. There were so many of us, there were 2 areas for coffee. The people in Sala Balint, if you can hear me, if you could move all the way through to the restaurant area, the Luce Saal, the windowed area, that's where you should have coffee, so that we can feed up and distribute ourselves between the bar area and the restaurant area, so there's not too many people waiting too long for coffee. And no doubt there are other things, but I don't want to repeat what Irene will tell us later. I have good news for those of you who need CME points. We have, yesterday, been approved. The week has been awarded 23 CME points. Certificates of attendance you can pick up from Irene. That is, however, independent of the CME points. If you wish to have CME, then there will be feedback forms which you have to fill out and send to me if you wish to obtain these CME points. And if there are already people online, online is free to watch. However, as a recognition of the not inconsiderable costs that are involved in live streaming, the CME points for people watching online will require a small payment. But for you here in the room, it's for free. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to our sponsors, without whom very little of this would be possible. Do visit their stands. They've got interesting things to show you and interesting things to discuss. Thank you, and have a great week. This one?
No, this one.
So which one? Ah, you've got it.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There are also seats in the very front row for you.
The seats in the front row are mostly reserved for faculty for the morning session, just so that there's no difficulties.
Sorry for
But,
interfering.
No.
So once again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Irene Schmidli. I'm the representative of the Congressi Stefano Francini, which we call CSF. And it's a pleasure to welcome you and give you some information about us and our services. Who are we? The CSF belongs to the ETH Zurich and provides a meeting platform since more than 30 years now. We have an average of 25 scientific and humanistic events per year and host around 2,000 participants here at Monte Verita. And the events last 3 to 5 days depending on the event type, and we, the CSF, give financial and administrative support. Applications is always a hot topic. The event season 24 is already fully booked. For 25, applications can be sent in till October 1st, and the second deadline will be January 24 in order to be a bit more flexible for the organizers. Applications for workshops can be sent in anytime, and we try to find a time slot with the Congress Center Monte Verita. In case you need further information, you're welcome to visit our website or to write to me or to my boss, Pere. Our role at Monte Verita: the Hotel Monte Verita belongs to the local government of the Canton Ticino and is managed by the Fondazione Monte Verita, whereas the ETH Zurich is a co-administrator and through us, the CSF, also a client of the Monte Verita Center. All of you received a conference bag with hopefully useful information. The PC room is located down the corridor to your right. If you're in front of the reception, there is a PC printer available for you 24 hours. This certificate of attendance, which Mark Fox mentioned, are ready for you to be picked up at my office. My office is kind of opposite this computer room, or you could also order it online afterwards by email. All other matters like taxi, meals, and so on, you may refer to the hotel reception. That's open also 24 hours for you. What is also important is to wear the name tag all the time, because that's important for the restaurant crew. Then the Hotel Monte Verita offers a free wireless network, which is working quite well in all buildings. Maybe you happen to walk around in the nice park area. There it might not be working in every corner, but a visit to the tea house might be interesting. And we hope that you'll enjoy your stay. And now I invite you to go back in history and enjoy a short film about Monte Verita.
The fascinating history of the Monte Verita began in 1900, when a small group of idealists from Northern Europe settled on a hilltop above Ascona in southern Switzerland. Their vision was to start a new life, an ideal society based on the principles of freedom, simplicity, a spirit of cooperation, a vegetarian diet, and a closer relationship with nature, which also included nudism. The central or social house was a meeting place for discussions and entertainment for the promoters and first inhabitants of the hill. Let us remember Alfredo Pioda, Theosophist, Erich Musam, and Otto Gross, anarchists. Henry Erdenkoffen, the son of a Belgian industrialist, and Ida Hoffmann, a piano teacher and feminist, both co-founders of the community, later sanatorium called Monteverita. The subsequent historical proprietor of the hill was the German Baron Eduard von der Heydt, a banker and passionate art collector, who in 1929 brought Bauhaus architecture to Ascona, along with a prestigious collection of primitive, Asian and non-European art. His hotel played host to the international jet set in the 1930s and retains several original Bauhaus furnishings. In keeping with its past as a historical meeting place, Monteverita today is a modern congress and cultural centre, which hosts international scientific conferences, workshops and business meetings. It offers a variety of indoor and outdoor meeting sites with wireless connection. In 1989, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology of Zurich designated Monteverita as venue for the Congressi Stefano Francini, its financially supported circuit of international scientific and humanistic meetings. Besides the Bauhaus Hotel, the Villa Semiramis offers additional accommodation. It is said that from the roof of this building, some locals used to buy tickets to peek down at the naked vegetarians. In fact, heliotherapy, naked air and light sunbathing was part of the Monteveritan health program, as were eurythmics, dancing, tennis and other sports. A genuine and healthy diet was, and still is, fundamental to the culinary philosophy of Monteverita. Seasonal and regional food is featured on every menu in its restaurant. Whether a congress meal, a banquet, a business lunch, or a romantic date. Another gathering point for the Monteveritans was the Anata House, a very peculiar building of the year 1904. With a flat roof and rounded interior corners. Since the late 1970s, it hosts the Museum of Monteverita's history, created by the man who rediscovered and relaunched the Hill of Truth, the internationally known exhibition maker Harold Zeeman.
Monteverita è come un museo dell'architettura. Perché c'è dalla capanna aria luce fino allo stile Bauhaus, c'è un po' di tutto.
The House of the Russians was one of the 14 light and air huts built by the first settlers. Some Russian exiles, perhaps even Trotsky, stayed there after 1905. In addition to anarchists, theosophists, communists and psychoanalysts, several artists, writers and poets such as Hermann Hesse, Friedrich Glauser, D.H. Lawrence, Mariana Verefkin, Alexei von Yavlensky, Hugo Ball, Paul Klee, Jean Arp, and his wife Sophie Teuber-Arp had a part in the animation and enlightenment of Monteverita and Ascona over the last century, reflecting numerous social and artistic movements of 20th century Europe. Dance continues to inspire those who are attracted to the hill. In the wake of the school of dance of the Hungarian choreographer Rudolf von Laban and his famous pupils from the beginning of the last century, Mary Wigman, Suzanne Perrottet, Katja Wolf and many others. A program of cultural activities, festivals, concerts, plays, readings and special events completes the present list of offerings at Monteverita, where the well-being of body and spirit still characterizes this corner of paradise.
Thanks for your attention, and we wish you an interesting week.
Thank you, and good morning. I'll share the good morning. I'm Peter Kahrilas. I'm here with Professor Clave, and we'll be chairing this first session. Starting at the top, as is customary in gastroenterology, it's the oropharyngeal aspect of this. I'll say at the beginning that dancing and nudity are optional. They are not required. And I'd like to introduce the first speaker, who is Dr. Nogah Nativ-Zeltzer, who comes to us from Tel Aviv. Dr. Zeltzer was a graduate student at Northwestern, and I had the pleasure of being her advisor in the end. She's going to speak to us about pharyngeal high-resolution manometry. Nogah? Oh, while she's getting that set, the program looks a little tight, and we're sure to run a little bit over, but we have time to spill into the coffee break, so don't worry about it too much. I know that Nathalie did us a great favor there by recording her 25-minute talk in 30 minutes, so yeah. We'll mind it.
Okay, so good morning. Naked vegetarians are a tough act to follow, but here I go. So I'll be discussing pharyngeal high-resolution manometry with videofluoroscopy. These are my financial disclosures. I have no relations with industry and no conflict of interest. So oropharyngeal dysphagia is extremely common. A recently published systematic review and meta-analysis determined that the incidence in healthcare facilities ranges from 37 to 50%. And dysphagia can have really severe health complications, including dehydration, malnutrition, and recurrent pneumonia. And we have some pretty effective tools to evaluate oropharyngeal dysphagia, such as endoscopic evaluation of swallowing and videofluoroscopic swallow studies. However, they also have some limitations, and if we take videofluoroscopy, which is considered the gold standard for oropharyngeal dysphagia evaluation, it can provide us a lot of valuable information, but it also has its limitations. It's a two-dimensional image. It has a limited temporal resolution of maximum 30 frames per second. Usually the analysis is qualitative and somewhat subjective. And it also may not identify subtle changes in early stages of disease. So, for example, if we look at this video.
Oh, so okay, for a video, it's anyway good.
So I'm pressing play. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if we look at this video, we see some inefficiency, a lot of post-swallow residue in the vallecula and the pharynx, and mostly in the piriform sinuses. However, pharyngeal swallowing biomechanics have many components, and this residue can be caused by different physiological underlying impairments, which can be difficult to tease out based on the interpretation of the video alone. So it could be caused by reduced base of tongue movement, decreased pharyngeal contraction, incomplete relaxation of the pharyngoesophageal segment, reduced compliance of the P musculature due to fibrosis or other reasons that may be causing reduced opening of the sphincter, or reduced high laryngeal movement that also diminishes its opening. So manofluorography, which is the concurrent use of manometry and videofluoroscopy to diagnose pharyngeal dysphagia, can allow us to leverage the best of two worlds for enhanced diagnostics. And manofluorography was pioneered by Dr. Fred McConnell, who also coined this term, and his colleagues in the late 1980s. And although it showed potential for adding clinical value, for many years it wasn't often used, likely due to different limitations and complexity of traditional conventional manometry systems. But of course, in recent decades, there has been wonderful technological advancements in manometry, such as the transition from water perfused systems to solid-state catheters, which provide more accurate measurements, but also more safe, especially for the pharynx. and unidirectional sensors, which have turned into circumferential sensors, especially important for the pharynx because it's characterized by circumferential asymmetry. And the transition from catheters with just few sensors to high-resolution manometry with 36 sensors spaced no more than 1 centimeter apart. And of course, the transition from line plots to pressure topography plots. And also today we can analyze these, both record and analyze these two tools concurrently. And this allows us to assess both the adequacy and the timing of key events of the oropharyngeal swallow. So as these new capabilities were emerging, I was fortunate to be doing my PhD at Northwestern along with my mentor, Dr. Peter Kahrilas, and the team at the Esophageal Center at Northwestern. We utilized high-resolution manofluorography to define areas of interest in the pharyngeal pressure topography in individuals without swallowing disorders. And this was done by meticulously matching the different physiologic events in the pharyngeal swallow, such as tongue-based retraction, for example, matched to the corresponding pressure changes in pressure topography. Our participants included 22 healthy individuals between the ages of 21 and 40 and 22 between the ages of 60 and 80. And they all underwent concurrent manometry and videofluoroscopy studies and had 3 trials each of different thin liquid barium bolus volumes, as well as 3 ml pudding, cookie, and also 3 trials of an effortful swallow intended to test the limits of pharyngeal pressure generation in the pharynx. We used a 2.75 outer diameter solid state manometry assembly with the sensors spaced 7.5 millimeters apart. And we devised 9 metrics, which were modeled after the esophageal pressure topography codified in the Chicago classification. The majority of these measures are contractile integrals, so they incorporate calculations of average pressure, regions, and time and span within marked regions of interest, such as the velopharyngeal closure, as you can see here marked in pink, the tongue-based region, hypopharyngeal contraction. We also had a global measure called the pharyngeal contractile integral, which incorporated the entire area of the pharynx. We also measured post-agglutinative upper esophageal contraction and proximal esophageal contraction. And these metrics were designed to quantify the contractile vigor and stability of different components of the pharyngeal response. Other measures included maximal pressures within those regions. And as a measure of the US relaxation, we developed the 0.25 second US IRP, which was developed also an adaptation of the esophagogastric junction IRP that was developed for esophageal HRM studies. And the US IRP is reflective of intrabolus pressure as it's passing through the sphincter, indicative of both the adequacy of its relaxation and opening. And here, we also very carefully tracked the movement of the UES, and you can really see the benefits and the importance of using videofluoroscopy to validate the measures on pressure topography as the UES moves discordantly with the catheter. And you can see its rise here in pink. At the height of the swallow, the UES moves an average of 18.6 millimeters away from the catheter. We also looked at age-related differences in pharyngeal swallowing pressures, and we found that pharyngeal and UES relaxation measures were all elevated in older versus young. And this was true for all consistencies and all bolus sizes. Only in the effortful swallow, the pharyngeal pressures were similar, suggesting that perhaps the older adults were utilizing more volitional effort in their swallows within a similar range of maximal capacity for pressure generation. And this increased pharyngeal contraction may be an attempt to compensate for other age-related changes, such as a more dilated pharynx or these increased pressure in the UES, this more resistant sphincter that has been observed by our study, but also by other studies. So here's an example of one of our study participants. This is a non-dysphagic younger swallow. This is a non-dysphagic older swallow. And you can see here the residual UES pressures and also this elevated pharyngeal contraction, perhaps as an attempt to push that bolus through a more resistant sphincter. We also observed significant gender differences with higher pressures generated during proximal esophageal contractions in males versus females for all bolus types. Measures of UES relaxation and UES post-deglutitive integral and proximal esophageal contraction showed an effect of the consistency of the bolus with higher pressures generated for thicker consistencies. And you can really see the effects of the effortful swallow compared to other bolus types and other more natural swallows. And so the effortful swallows differed significantly from all other trials in all pharyngeal and UES relaxation measures. But interestingly, the effortful swallow seemed to also affect measures of post-deglutitive UES contraction and proximal esophageal contraction, which differed significantly compared to some of the other bolus trial types, suggesting that maybe there was a downstream effect of the effortful swallow. We also looked at the effects of catheter diameter on UES and proximal esophageal pressures, comparing to a different group who had undergone the same studies with 5 ml boluses. And we found that there were significantly higher pressures with the large diameter catheter for all the 4 measures. So this study, along with many others, provided an essential step for advancing clinical application of pharyngeal high-resolution manometry. And in recent decades, more and more research has emerged, better clarifying its utility. And some of these studies have used both concurrent high-resolution manometry and videofluoroscopy, and have demonstrated the power of using both these tools to improve understanding of swallow physiology and pathophysiology, assess the effects of therapeutic strategies on the pharyngeal swallow, validate manometric detection of aspiration, reveal early signs of swallowing disorders when early stages of disease, and aid in differential diagnosis. And so I'll discuss some of these studies and review what they've shown. So some studies have utilized the combined tools to advance our understanding of swallow physiology, such as this study by May et al., who identified 6 UES pressure phases and used simultaneous videofluoroscopy and manometry to describe the functional anatomy underlying each UES pressure phase. And one of the interesting observations that they had in this study was to identify a UES pressure rise immediately prior to deglutitive relaxation. And they found that this pressure increase also occurs concurrently with increasing pressure within the pharyngeal chamber, which they hypothesized was intended to maintain a seal on the pharyngeal chamber, allowing pressure to grow in the pharynx, which also contributed to creating a relative vacuum distally when that pressure was released later. Another recent study published by Clave et al. Used concurrent HRM and video to identify factors influencing self-selected volumes and see how they differ biomechanically from the predetermined, standardized volumes of swallow that we tend to use in instrumental studies. So to achieve this, they took measurements from both videofluoroscopy and HRM, and they found that the natural swallows were associated with lower maximum tongue base region pressures, but similar integral pressures compared to the standardized sizes, suggesting that a natural swallow utilizes more efficient swallowing dynamics than swallowing with pre-measured volumes. DeMarcus et al. Integrated measurements from videofluoroscopy and HRM to demonstrate a reduced compliance and subtle changes in UES function in early and moderate Parkinson's disease. They also demonstrated the effects of vocalization task on these measures on both videofluoroscopy and manometry. And Pere et al. Identified alterations in pressure flow metrics derived from impedance manometry in events of bolus spillage into the pharynx prior to the swallow, as observed on videofluoroscopy. So what they found was that pharyngeal mean impedance, which is correlating with reduced pharyngeal distension, and UES mean impedance correlating with reduced US opening, were significantly higher in the patient group with pre-swallow bolus spillage into the pharynx compared to patients without. So pharyngeal HRM and videofluoroscopy have also been utilized to assess the effects of therapeutic approaches to improving the pharyngeal swallow. Agrawal et al. Evaluated the biomechanical effects of a resistance exercise program called Swallowing Against Laryngeal Resistance, or SALR, on the pharyngeal phase of swallowing. And they were able to demonstrate both significant biomechanical improvements on videofluoroscopy and improvement in pharyngeal contractile integral in the SALR group versus the sham group. And this second study by Zhang et al. In 2016 used concurrent VFSS and HRM to assess swallow function in patients post-laryngectomy. And they also looked at the effects of CP dilation on the swallowing measures taken from both tools. And they found that hypopharyngeal intrabolus pressure was most predictive of symptomatic improvement after dilation. One of the potential advantages of adding pharyngeal HRM to the diagnostic process is its potential to identify subtle changes in swallow function at early stages of the disease. So in this study by Jones and Chuchi, they demonstrated differences in maximum pressure in the velopharynx and differences in pharyngeal swallowing pressure variability within the individual in the velopharynx at early stages of Parkinson's disease, even when there were not yet signs of swallow dysfunction on videofluoroscopy. So a multimodal approach may be the best for evaluating patients at very early stages of neurodegenerative diseases. One of the anatomical areas where the combination of the two tools can be most informative is that of the pharyngeal esophageal segment. So two different papers report on two different cases which really demonstrate how the combination of these diagnostics can help in differential diagnosis. So Koenig et al. Described a case of a patient who had aspiration after the swallow due to piriform sinusitis. And however, there was no radiographic evidence of a UES stricture or any opening impairment. But pressure topography, however, did reveal incomplete UES opening, as we can see here in this picture. I don't think you can see my, oh, there it is. And they also used the HRM to see which therapeutic strategy was most efficient. And you can see here that the head turn to the right with a chin tuck was actually very effective in prolonging the upper esophageal sphincter opening. Whereas in this other case by Davidson et al., they reported videofluoroscopic findings, a patient where videofluoroscopic findings initially appeared to indicate decreased opening extent and duration of the UES, resulting in the majority of the bolus remaining in the piriform sinuses, and also post-swallow aspiration. However, manometric assessment revealed normal UES function, but a low pharyngeal contractile integral, reflecting reduced pharyngeal contraction, which was likely explaining this post-swallow residue. So the importance of accurately identifying the exact physiologic cause for why the bolus is not passing through the upper esophageal sphincter has a lot of clinical importance because it can really direct sometimes treatment recommendations to a surgical approach versus a rehabilitative approach. Another novel application of the use of the two tools is to investigate the relationship between pressures in the pharyngeal-esophageal segment and tracheoesophageal phonation in patients post-total laryngectomy. So Zhang et al. Found that sufficient pressure gradient from below and above the PES were required for a satisfactory tracheoesophageal phonation. So information derived from high-resolution manofluorography can help perhaps guide proper candidate selection for TEP, both puncture and placement, and also help assess the need for possible PES dilation in certain patients with poor tracheoesophageal phonation. So should we be using HRMs alone or with videofluoroscopy? So videofluoroscopy can really provide us visualization of key components of the swallow that we're not able to see on HRM alone, We can only see oral stages of the swallow on videofluoroscopy. We can easily observe airway invasion on videofluoroscopy, but also see the patient's response to the penetration and aspiration and assess if that response was actually effective in clearing out that aspiration or residue. It can also help guide us on identification of physiology on pressure topography plots, and also help identify structural abnormalities that we may not be able to see on HRM alone. So for example, if we look at this patient with a normal swallow, even though there's some individual variation, even in the normal swallow pressure topography plot, we can fairly easily delineate the different areas of anatomy and physiology and take measurements. However, it becomes definitely more difficult when we have a patient with a disordered swallow. So then it becomes more difficult to confidently assess, for example, where the velopharyngeal pressure is or where the upper esophageal sphincter pressure is in a patient such as this one or this one or this one. Also, if we look at this pressure topography plot, we see some heightened pressure here, but we don't really know what's causing it. But when we add the videofluoroscopy, we're able to see this very large osteophyte that is pushing up against the catheter and creating also an obstruction to the bolus flow, resulting in a deep laryngeal penetration and post-swallow residue. So this really demonstrates the value of the two tools concurrently. So to summarize, high-resolution manometry and videofluoroscopy are complementary tools. Pharyngeal HRM with VFSS can be really beneficial in differentiating impairment, detection of subtle changes occurring in the swallow at early stages of disease, identifying the best treatment strategy, but also tracking treatment progress in an objective manner. And while there's definitely cases that one of these tools is sufficient, the synergy of these tools can really provide the most comprehensive and safe assessment of oropharyngeal swallowing evaluation. These are my references. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Nogah. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive explanation about the combination of all techniques. Is there any question on the audience? Please, could you please identify yourself and then make your question, please? We have plenty of time for discussion, so go ahead, please.
Good morning, Ishairon from Tel Aviv, Israel.
Hello.
I would like to ask, do you think that it's mandatory to do both examinations simultaneously? I mean, just the very fact that insertion of a catheter may change physiology for itself, especially with stress patients who you are really checking the physiology, not to talk also about esophageal manometry, which also may change the physiology by the insertion of a foreign object. Could it be done separately? Would you still get the same information that you are looking for, or you need to do it concurrently?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. I think that ideally we would do it simultaneously, because I think we can make sure we're identifying the exact physiologic components that we're looking at and measuring. That can be logistically challenging sometimes, and so I think that there's also definitely a lot of information we can get by doing them separately. And yes, the catheter can change the physiology of it, but that's why we allow for an acclimation period to allow at least some of the stress to reduce and before we get started with the actual study.
And in this particular point, are you aware of any study comparing the results, for instance, on safe to swallow with and without the catheter? So do you believe that the catheter can impair epiglottic tilting or hyoid ascent?
I'm not aware that there was, that anyone measured, to my knowledge, the effect on epiglottic inversion. I do think there was a study with conventional manometry looking at the effects and did find some effects of the placement of the catheter on the pressures.
Any other questions on the audience?
Johannes Linglinger from Bern. Fascinating talk, thank you. One question is, how do you synchronize these two devices exactly? Because timing is crucial. Everything is moving very fast in the oropharyngeal area. Is there a commercial system available that synchronizes these two technologies?
Yes, the major manometry systems have a system for recording them and having them be concurrently, simultaneously matched in time. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Mario Costantini from Padua, Italy. I've been playing with this monofluorography for a while, some 3 decades ago, but then we abandoned because it's a very complex text in very complex patients. But one of the problems was that videofluorography was a qualitative description, qualitative examination. So the question is, are you aware of some numbers or score system for classifying patients with disorders or motility? Because otherwise it's just a movie that you see and you say, well, there is an impairment, but you cannot quantify the quantity of the impairment and to treat the patient in a way better than in another way. Thanks. Yeah. Excellent communication.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have several semi-quantitative tools, such as the MBS-IMP, which clinicians can go through extensive training process. This was pioneered by Dr. Bonnie Martin-Harris at Northwestern, and they allow us to take measure, at least rate the degree of impairment of different physiological aspects of the swallow and videofluoroscopy. But there's also actually objective measurements that can be taken by several tools, such as a tool called Swallowtail, which allows with a pretty easy software to take objective measurements of different aspects of videofluoroscopy and then compare them to established norms so that can give you something more quantitative.
You might also wait on Nathalie's talk there, the third one, which is entitled Classifying Pharyngeal and UES Disorders Based on High-Resolution Manometry.
And we will discuss the metrics for videofluoroscopy in the next session. So I'm interested in your opinion on 2 topics. One is, what is, in your opinion, the best and the worst X-ray contrast to do this kind of studies? And what's, excuse me, in your opinion, the best and the worst thickening agent to thicken fluids for this kind of studies? What do you use?
Okay, so I think ideally using Varibar with the standardized consistencies. And if you're doing, of course, the study simultaneously. And then I think that's probably best are large volumes, as much as the patient can tolerate, of so 10 or 20 mLs of liquid.
Any other question on the audience? Last question. Just a second. Please introduce yourself.
Just a question. It appears that the high... Just a second. It's not working. Okay. Sumit Metal Phoenix. It appears that the high pharyngeal pressures in elderly is in response to the incomplete relaxation of the UES, right? But why is that the case in older people? Why does the UES relax less? Is that in response to reflux? Or is it in response to some deep muscle degeneration? What do you think it's in response to? Any thoughts?
So I think likely it's more of a reduced opening rather than the neurological relaxation. And some studies have shown that the upper esophageal sphincter, as we age, tends to get more fibrotic, less compliant, and likely that's the cause of less opening.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our second speaker is Taher Omari. Professor Taher Omari is a gastrointestinal physiologist and principal research fellow at the Flinders Health and Medical Research Institute of Flinders University in Australia. And as you know, he is the father of the swallowing gateway, a method to analyze for high-resolution manometry and impedance. So Taher, please, go ahead. And welcome.
Taher, just 1 second. We're just going to try and... So the lighting is a bit brighter than perhaps some of you might ideally like because we're filming, and otherwise we can't see Taher in all his splendor. And but it looks like we can adjust it. Can we set this as an establishment as is best?
So, can we start?
Sorry, Taher.
Okay. Thanks very much, and thanks for that introduction. Very kind. So I'll be talking about pharyngeal high-resolution manometry with impedance, which is a technique that we use fairly routinely. We do it as a standalone test. We do it concurrently and simultaneously with videofluoroscopy. So it depends on the case as to whether what procedure we would be doing. These are my declarations. So I'm actually in a position where there are going to be a number of talks that talk about these methodologies with impedance to derive objective metrics and so forth. So rather than perhaps repeat things that will be said later on, I am going to give a sort of more generalised discussion, and I just want to talk about the impedance signals themselves. And the catheters that we use have evolved over time. Originally, when I was getting into this, I was making the catheters myself. Guided by John Dent, who was, the person who invented the Dent sleeve. But over time, we've obviously had access to better technologies for making the measurements, and we've also played around with the way we plot the data, and that's something I want to explore with you today. So I'm not going to really introduce anything new in terms of physiology of swallow that hasn't really been known already. I mean, all of this knowledge has existed for 30 or 40 years, but I want to talk about how we display the waveforms and also how the waveforms qualitatively and to some degree quantitatively can tell us about propulsion and clearance of bolus swallows. So of course we're using impedance, and I'm pretty sure I don't need to explain it to this audience. I'm sure all of you are clinicians using it for measurement of reflux and maybe in the esophagus to assess bolus flow. But the key thing, of course, is we're measuring the resistivity to electrical current. If you have a conductive bolus, then the impedance will drop, and this nadir point reflects the thickest part of the bolus. And so the signals themselves are determined by the diameter of the cross-sectional area of the lumen, and also the conductivity of the test bolus that's being swallowed. And we're measuring it across 2 centimetres as a rule. So we interpolate in between. So there's, in terms of precision, it's not quite the same as manometry, which is done with discrete points that are sensing the forces that are generated within the pharynx. So this was our first attempt at looking at impedance within the pharynx, a collaboration with Ian Cook and his team in Sydney. This was a great fun doing this study. But what we discovered was that in fact, the pattern of impedance that we see in the pharynx is a lot more complex than in the esophageal lumen. So we naively thought we could just take the work that had been done by Don Castell and Radu Tatounian and Shea and Sifram and just put it into and make it work in the pharynx. But it didn't quite work out that way. And there were a few issues. So obviously the pharynx at rest is open to the air. So you're measuring a very high level of impedance, which is not stable because there may be a level of mucosal contact, which will drop the impedance, but also the contact between the tongue base and the posterior pharyngeal wall, and with the catheter in between, appears to also obscure the recording. So if you use the 50% of baseline criteria, then in fact the major upstroke that in the esophagus would reflect clearance of the bolus actually is just telling you when the pharynx opens post-swallow. So We did play around with trying to optimise the criteria. We had some level of success. Michael Szczesniak did some all sorts of detailed analysis to try to settle on specific criteria for different levels within the pharynx. And we also started experimenting with these two-tone colour plots for impedance, so using a threshold to define when there's bolus. And you can see you can correct, this is the artefact, and you can correct that. But in the long run, this wasn't really reliable when we were looking at patients. And the other thing too is by just looking at these two colour, a single colour, you really can't assess the distension area, which is something that impedance is telling you. So something that was a game changer for us was to actually convert the signals we were recording to admittance. So impedance is a measure of resistivity, admittance is a measure of conductivity. And so what we're doing is we're inverting the signal. So when there's a conductive bolus, the signal goes up. But we're also changing not just the directionality, but the scale of the recording. So if we plot impedance versus millisiemens admittance, you get this nonlinear relationship. But the relevant measurements of impedance in terms of bolus flow are right down at the bottom end here of the impedance scale. So, and then there's all of this headroom that's taken up with signals that are essentially noise because of mucosal contact or air. So you can, to some degree, address this by, say, for example, a log transformation of the data, but that doesn't necessarily fix the problem of directionality and linearity of the signal. So the relationship between ohms impedance and bolus cross-sectional area is inverse and nonlinear, whilst the relationship between admittance and bolus cross-sectional area is linear, and it's a positive correlation. So this means that intuitively, when you see an admittance signal, you get a rise in the signal because of the bolus, and the change in the signal is directly reflective of the change in cross-sectional area. So it actually does matter. So it's not just the fact the signals are going up and down, it actually does matter. And so I'm just showing here a bench test. The catheter, impedance catheter in a tube, it's going to fill with saline and then drain out. So the first time, and on the side here, you'll see this is just a simulation of a bolus. It's just a trick that everyone does with impedance. So there you go, tube's filling, and now the tube's empty. So you can see quite nicely that the impedance does record the clearance of the bolus. But did you see the tube fill? Let's try it again. There you go, tube's filling. Did you see it fill? Well, maybe. It was a bit noisy, wasn't it? So let's look at admittance now. There you go, tube's filling, tube's emptying. So this is just an illustration, just qualitatively, that it actually does matter that we plot it in this way. So what does it look like in vivo? Well, here's a patient with a very functional swallow. Here's the impedance recording, and you can see the actual drop with the bolus is right down at the bottom end, and you've got all this noise at the baseline, and you have a major upstroke of recovery, which has got nothing to do with the bolus flow. It's more to do with the pharynx opening up post-swallow. But if we plot the admittance, what you can see very nicely is this beautiful wave of distension, which is actually reflecting lingual propulsion of the bolus through the pharyngoesophageal segment. So that's a sort of healthy-looking swallow. What about an abnormal swallow? Well, here we go. This is quite an abnormal swallow. Lots of pre-swallow residue because from a swallow before, and residue left behind because this is a pharynx that doesn't clear because there is absent contraction within the hypopharynx. If we look at the impedance signal, it's just garbage. You can't make sense of that. This signal here is just reflecting the opening of the pharynx after the bolus has passed. But if we look at the admittance recording, then yes, we can see nicely here this wave of distension going down the esophagus. We can also resolve the fact that there's an elevated baseline before the initiation of swallow and also an elevated baseline after, which fits with the picture on radiology. Okay, so we know from lots of work done by others in comparing, just looking at radiology, but also radiology with high-resolution manometry, that there's this distinction between lingual propulsion from the tongue and clearance. So clearance begins with the essentially the tongue base retracting and opposing the posterior pharyngeal wall, and then you have sequential contraction of the hypopharyngeal constrictors which clear the bolus away. And we can resolve this bolus propulsion and clearance quite well with radiology, but we can also see this with impedance. And I'm just highlighting here some sort of making a comparison between these modern day recordings with a classic study that was done by Dr. Kahrilas some 30 years ago, where he beautifully described how boluses are propelled from the tongue into the pharynx, and the really importance of volume. So what was described back then was that the pharyngeal chamber is mechanically optimized for a large volume. So if you swallow a small volume, then the chamber capacity is not really used. And so what then happens is that you then rely on the pharyngeal constrictors to actually propel the bolus. And we can see this beautifully with these distension contraction plots. So you can see here's a small volume, there's the distension wave from the lingual propulsion, but it stops. And if we come down here, just look at a magnified view, here's the distension peak travelling much closer to the hypopharyngeal contraction. So it's demonstrating this reliance on the hypopharyngeal contraction to transfer a small bolus. And so the latency from this distension peak to the contraction peak is very short. And you compare that then to a 10 mil bolus where the bolus is transmitted all the way through the upper sphincter down into the esophagus. There's a very long latency here, and really what the pharynx is doing is clearing away the remnant of the bolus at the bolus tail. And interestingly, with a 5 mil bolus, you get sort of an in-between picture where you get two waves of distension. The first wave is obviously the lingual propulsion. The second wave is the pharyngeal propulsion. So this is just to illustrate that. And so this is a healthy swallow with normal propulsion, but just made ineffective because of a small volume. What about when you have weakness? So this was a review that I had the pleasure of writing with Dr. Mittal, and it's quite expansive. It goes into all sorts of interesting new ideas, or depends on your point of view, crazy ideas about how to use this information in the esophagus. But just illustrating here, a patient with very weak pharyngeal contraction, and this latency between propulsion and contraction is quite short. So the hypopharynx is more relevant to this patient, even though there's a strong hypopharyngeal contraction. Obviously the lingual propulsion is impaired. And in fact, we can show a clear relationship. Now that we're building big data sets, we're able to look precisely at the relationship between the strength of, for example, mesopharyngeal contraction and this propulsive latency. So when you have a weak mesopharynx, then this latency is shorter, and there's actually a correlation with weaker MCI correlating with shorter DCL. So of course that's lingual propulsion, but if you're missing a hypopharyngeal contraction, then you won't be able to clear the bolus because there's no mechanism there to actually make that happen. Now of course you see that on radiology and on the high-res manometry. You can see the absence of the contraction there. But on the distension contraction plots, you can see the same thing. So you see this wave of distension here reflecting good lingual propulsion in this case, but then the absence of a stripping wave, which means that residue is left behind. And this just breaks it down to a few different frames. You can see here the early part of the swallow, a nice intrabolus pressure gradient and the bolus being propelled nicely. But then as time goes by, there's no stripping wave, and gradually the bolus divides into two. So the distal bolus, part of the bolus, it divides into two when the upper sphincter reconstitutes in pressure, and that divides the bolus, and then the distal bolus is being continued to be propelled, but the other half of the bolus is retained. Now we can measure this, and we've explored all sorts of different ways of measuring residue with impedance manometry, and it may turn out that the simplest idea may work best. So this is just simply using the topography to guide where you measure the admittance, but then we can break it down to different phases of the swallow where we measure it. But I'm most interested in this post-swallow admittance reading here in box 4. And we've done some work on this, and we can see with a fairly objective radiological measure called the normalised residue ratio scale. In the piriform sinus, you can see a relationship between the admittance recorded on the catheter and the presence of abnormal residue. So the admittance is higher. And this is actually quite a good predictor, and it's actually in these data a better predictor than the contractility measures for the hypopharynx, and also appeared to be a good predictor of aspiration risk as well. And the same thing, a better predictor in terms of ROC curve area than the contractile measures. So this is Swallow Gateway. This is a online resource that we created at Flinders University. It's open to access, but you do have to pay a subscription fee. We need to do that to fund the storage of data and further development. But we've really come to use these plots, quite routinely. So we do obviously the analysis of a captured swallow, but then we can switch between these different plots to actually have a look at the bolus clearance features. And of course, dietary modifications, thickening fluids is an important clinical thing that's done for patients, and it's important to determine what level of thickness is needed. And just illustrating here that the distension contraction plots can pick up pre-swallow bolus presence, so early arrival of the bolus in the pharynx, which you can correct by giving a viscous bolus. But interestingly, it doesn't always work out that way. So you see this case of a patient, same sort of apparent picture, but then when you give a viscous, you get a very different story. So it probably relates to the fact that this patient does have some level of upper sphincter dysfunction. And so in this scenario, thickening may not be that helpful. Now, if you're going to test different thicknesses, something that's critically important is you have to standardise the conductivity of the medium that you're testing with. We made the mistake very early on, looking at different boluses with different conductivities, and it affected what we were measuring. So it's important to, across viscosity levels, to measure the conductivity and ensure that it's stable. And this is something that we've developed in conjunction with Trisco Foods to try to achieve that. And also, if you're testing thickeners in this context, you also need to test the rheology and understand the rheological properties, as I'm sure Professor Clave will tell us later on. But that's something that we've done as well. So in summary, I think these plots really matter. I think they're worthwhile plotting. They're worthwhile looking at qualitatively. And obviously, you can derive some quantitative metrics from it as well. But again, just to stress, if you want to embark on this journey with impedance, you need to really think about what you're giving as a test bolus and try to standardise the conductivity properties across different viscosity ranges. I just acknowledge my colleagues back at Flinders, most of whom couldn't make it, so just like to thank them, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Taher. Is there any question on the audience? Please identify yourself and go ahead.
Great. Thanks very much, John Clark from
Stanford,
Redwood City, Stanford. Yeah, it was a wonderful talk. Just a practical question for you. So, if you wanted to do video fluoromanometry with impedance, with commercial analysis plus swallow gateway, how is that possible with each system commercially that's out, or is there only one company that does that?
It's compatible with all systems. Okay. So all systems export data in some format, and so we've designed it so it takes data from all systems.
And just from a practical standpoint, in terms of timing, if you wanted to read these studies, how long do you think it would take from start to finish if you were doing the manometry, the fluoro, the impedance, everything along those lines?
how long is a piece of string? I mean, it depends on what the depth and breadth of your protocol and what the patient can tolerate. The minimum protocol would be 5 and 10 mil thin liquid, and maybe with some viscous, and so you've got about 9 swallows to analyse, which doesn't take very long.
Okay. And
the actual procedure is 15 minutes.
Okay. And in cost with the doing the gateway protocol, what is that per year or per case? Do you know?
You can look at the website, and all that information is there. It's a complicated costing based on what you want to do with the system and how much you want to get from it. So.
Thank you, Dr. Sifrin.
Yes, I'm Daniel Sifrin from London. What is the relationship between the distension and the contraction? In other words, is there a link between the amount of distension and the strength or timing of the pharyngeal contraction?
There is. I think those of you doing this sort of procedure will be aware that a lot of patients with UES dysfunction do have augmented upstream pressures, so particularly in the velopharynx and mesopharynx. So if you have the higher distension pressures, you generate higher contractile pressures in a normal system as a compensatory response. So there is, certainly in terms of distension pressure and wall tension, there's a relationship. In terms of timing, it's not clear that there's because the timing can just vary so much depending on the particular pathophysiology you're looking at.
Any other questions? In the meantime, I have a request that is, please use international system of units to explain and to show shared viscosity, because we are scientists and we want to reproduce all these studies. So
absolutely, I fully agree with you, and it's something that we've characterised the rheology, and that we'll publish that information so that people have access to it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, Santosh Senegopali from Sydney. I didn't quite understand how you derived the admittance from the impedance. I assume it's not a directly inverse because one was log scale and one was linear. So could you explain how you do it?
It's just the inverse product.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's very simple.
Okay, thanks.
Simple to do, but seems to make a big difference.
Thank you. Any other question? How do you imagine your swallow way in 5 years? Integrating what information and providing what information?
Well, I think what it offers is a standardised system that is uniform, that derives metrics and plots things in a standardised way, and it's not the only solution, but I think we've been at this for some time, so I think we're sort of putting out there our view of how software should work and what it should give you, and trying to do our best to provide the validation that it's required. So, I'd like it. There's more to it than analysis, let's say, and we do have a session at the conference later on to discuss that. But dysphagia is a multidisciplinary problem, right? And the relevant clinicians, there might be a speech pathologist involved in every case, but the actual clinicians, the other clinicians that are managing the patient, could be a head and neck surgeon, it could be a neurologist, it could be a gastroenterologist. So these are multidisciplinary teams that manage these patients. So the beauty of Swallow Gateway being an online system, you can actually talk to each other about cases. So that's an important thing that's built into that system, but also from the point of view of research, to be able to share cases, to build big data sets, all that kind of thing are the extra things that this system is for. So we have a publication with over 500 patients and 120 controls, and it was only possible to generate that data set by sharing data across 3 centres using Swallow Gateway as the uniform system that allowed it to come together. There were about 6 different catheter configurations, for patients that were enrolled in that. So it's, so there are multiple layers of added value that we see as this offering, and so it certainly made a big difference for our own research program in terms of our ability to generate data and publish papers.
Last question.
Congratulations, Taher. Osvaldo Borrell from London. I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist, just by default. This is the same question I did, almost 6 years ago. Do you think that videofluoroscopy and pH impedance manometry are still complementary, and in the future we are just going to use the impedance manometry?
Look, videofluoroscopy tells you things that you can't see on these tests, so it's not going to replace it for everyone, but certainly there are a lot of cases that we study with this technique as a standalone procedure where they may have had a fluoroscopy in recent times, so there's no real need to repeat the fluoroscopy, in our opinion. You can just do this procedure, understanding, what the fluoroscopy showed in terms of safety as the paramount aspect. So I think, I think they're complementary, but I believe more and more people will use manometry as we go down, as people get more comfortable with looking at these plots and relying on them. I think that's the thing. You do need to do a lot of this to get confident about what you're seeing.
Thank you, Taher, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Our next speakers cannot be here. It's Dr. Nathalie Rommel, who got corona yesterday. So Nathalie Rommel is full professor at the Faculty of Medicine at University of Leuven. She runs the deglutology research program, focusing on the development of pharyngeal and esophageal motility, the pathophysiology of dysphagia, novel diagnostic methods to assess motility disorders, and the evaluation of current treatment modalities for upper GI disorders. She sent us a presentation, so we will be happy to see the video.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this part of...
1 second. Yeah. No, I think it's the system volume.
The pharyngeal session, which I'm going to talk about classifying pharyngeal and UVS disorders. I intended to be with you and to give you this talk live, but things have turned out differently. I'm very grateful to Mark that I have the opportunity to record this talk and give it to you via video recording, and also grateful to Taher Omari, who will address any questions in relation to this talk afterwards. So, as said, I was asked to talk about classifying pharyngeal and UVS disorders, and in fact I should use another title. I would need to say it's the complexity of classifying pharyngeal and UVS disorders. First of all, these are my speaker declaration as requested, and I think in parallel to what we have learned in setting up the protocol and the esophageal classification, I think the aims for pharyngeal HRM investigation should be understanding the underlying mechanism of disease, provide a conclusive diagnosis, and in terms of the pharynx, then that should be dysfunction, as in pharyngeal weakness, UVS dysfunction, or in terms of symptoms that we understand whether there's residue and aspiration, in order to guide rational treatment and to improve quality of life. But very importantly, it is important that we remember that technology needs to serve patient management, and that there should be a patient-centered benefit, which was already discussed in the literature as well a few years ago. There is definitely a lot of interest in high-resolution manometry to assess the upper sphincter and the pharynx. And as you can see here, over the last 20 years, we had about 263 papers. Over the last 10 years, that there were 217. But even in the last 3 years, 77 papers were published on PubMed. And that cutoff of the 2020 has definitely to do with the fact that an international working group has presented a protocol and some core pharyngeal HRM metrics. It was a working group consisting of experts working with high-resolution manometry from all over the world. And the outcome of it was based on a literature review and a majority expert agreement based on Adelphi. And in terms of the systems to use, it was advised to use solid state with at least 10 pressure sensors. And if impedance was included, to add it at 2 centimeter spacing. That catheter placement should be taught to someone who's using it, that shell should be used, anesthetic to the nasal passage is advised, and that it is possible to sip some liquid via straw during the placement. In terms of the test boluses and providing the boluses, it was advised to use a seated position, head neutral, deliver the food by syringe, and have volumes of 5, 10 ml, and sometimes 20 ml, and a minimum of 3 repeats. Apart from the protocol, core metrics were advised based on pharyngeal contractility and also in UES function. But we'll come into more detail. But the newest thing here is that within these metrics, regional differences were used. The proximal part of the esophagus was included, and bolus flow as measured with impedance was included. If we want to move towards an HRM classification, I think we had some questions to answer, and not all of them are answered yet, but we are making progress. So the first question is the proposed protocol that was proposed appropriate? What metrics are reliable and clinically relevant? For example, is there a link with dysphagia outcomes or with residue or with aspiration? How do we interpret these metrics? What do we mean by normal? Is normal or abnormal as compared to controls, like using an upper or lower limit of normal? Or should we use abnormal in the sense that, is it a specific cutoff value that corresponds with symptoms of the patient? The third thing is that it should be an easy workflow and preferably an algorithm. Now let me start with the update on the protocol. There has been work done from all over the world to check on a few things that were unsure. Do we use topical anesthetic? Has it an impact on the swallow? It was shown that there was no improvement in comfort, but it wasn't altering the swallowing physiology either. Two studies have shown this. The all-time question whether we should use circumferential or unidirectional sensors in performing pharyngeal manometry. One study addressed the fact of volume and viscosity in using circumferential and unidirectional sensor, and the finding there was that all the data were largely consistent with the reports using unidirectional sensors. Should we use volitional or natural swallows, or should we still use the swallows that as given? It was a very recent study showed that volitional, when using volitional swallows, that the pressures increase in variability if you do a lot of volitional consecutive swallowing tasks. And for some, it may be for example, in Parkinson's disease, it may be an indicator of a compensatory response in patients with impaired motor systems. Natural swallows, on the other hand, are more uniform and provide more efficient swallowing dynamics than structured swallowing. So these are elements that I think need to be taken with us in the future in how we analyze and what swallows we offer. A Cochrane review from last year compared all studies on HRM. And interestingly, the conclusion there was that a lot of the studies do not use, even the recent studies do not use the protocol and the metrics in clinical practice and research. So their advice was to use them. And that is going to help us a way forward to perform uniform research. And then the last factor on the protocol is something broader than just the protocol. It's the factors that impact on taking a protocol to the clinic. The clinical adoption of pharyngeal high-resolution manometry, in a very interesting paper was published by Rogus Puglia and colleagues in 2 years ago, which they describe what the scope of practice, access, clinical workflow should be, and how reimbursement should be looked at. But I'm sure we will learn about that more in the rest of the day. If we look apart from the protocol, the international working group looked at core outcome metrics. For the pharyngeal luminal occlusion pressures, the overall pharyngeal contractile integral, but also in velo, meso, and hypopharynx, the integral was proposed. These are metrics that are visible, and sometimes the hypopharyngeal intrabolus pressure is visible as well. On the other hand, there are also some not visible or non-visible metrics, such as UVS relaxation as measured with the integrated relaxation pressure and the UVS relaxation time. The UVS opening is then measured with the maximum admittance based on impedance and shown here in purple. These metrics need to be validated, and that is needed because we want to know which HRM metrics discriminate normal from pathological swallowing. Do they link to dysphagia outcomes? And are some of them predictive of dysphagia outcomes? There was some work done using pharyngeal high-resolution manometry to look at normal physiology. Did it learn us anything else or anything new from the older studies that were done with no high-resolution manometry? So on the deglutative parameters, non-deglutative parameters correlated with age, height, and weight was shown, that an upright position has an effect on the UVS basal pressure in the sense that it's lower, and that the high pressure zone is less extended. Another finding was that it's more a time effect, that the UVS basal pressure decreased over time, but these are elements where high resolution manometry not necessarily has an improved or an added value to normal manometry, low res manometry. In terms of deglutative metrics, high resolution manometry showed no correlation with sex, height, or weight. And in terms of the relation between age and deglutative metrics, the literature is varying. Some say there is no effect. Other papers say that the pharyngeal contractility is variable and differs. And another study showed that there was an age effect on UES function. And finally, more and multiple studies have looked at the effect of increased bolus volume and viscosity on how the swallow biomechanics are changed, so at the modulary effect. And one example is, for example, here on pharyngeal contractility on the lower horizontal axis, you can see volume and the thickness level expressed by the ITSI level. 0 is like liquid and 4 is a custard type, semi-solid type. And you can see in terms of pharyngeal contractility, the different parameters that are from the core metrics have only been limited be affected by it. Whereas if you look at the effect from volume and ITSI level on the UVS opening, on the relaxation and intrabolus pressure, those are far more clear affected by change in volume and ITSI, and also in timing. You can see that volume and consistency is affected by it. Now, the validation we looked at with a few centers together to validate the pharyngeal contractile metrics in dysphagic patients retrospectively in about 500 patients ranging from 18 till 90 years of age with heterogeneous dysphagia. And we compared their data to 120 controls, healthy volunteers, asymptomatic of dysphagia. And we looked at 10 ml liquid swallows. And in terms of the pharyngeal contractile measures, we found that it was only the mesopharynx and the peak pressure in the hypopharynx that was able to look and to find a difference between the controls and the patients, and that it is the age effect was hardly proven there. If we look then specifically in a group of patients with weak pharyngeal contractility, because in the end, it's the group that we want to also understand. These are our patients. So we did a study to evaluate the diagnostic performance of these metric in relation to videofluoroscopy detected signs of safety, which is aspiration, and efficiency, which is residue. And this was a subset of patients of 260 swallows, but in about 70 patients, all at the end of their 60s, and almost half of them was aspirating and the others not. And what we found, no matter how we tried to combine the metrics, whether by location or by number of regions, it was extremely difficult to prove that these metrics were jointly or in combination valuable. What we did find was that some of the core metrics were predictive of aspiration and residue, and these were the vilopharyngeal contractile integral, the mesopharyngeal contractile integral, the proximal contractile integral, and the swallow risk index. These are core metrics, but also the hypopharyngeal peak pressure, which was not in the core metrics, seemed to be a strong parameter. And here you can see the receiver operating characteristic curve for aspiration with its sensitivity of the metrics that were predictive. And as you can see here in green, the hypopharyngeal peak pressure, the swallow risk index, and the proximal contractile integral are the metrics that are highly predictive for aspiration. And in terms of residue in the performed sinus, there the swallow risk index and again the hypopharyngeal peak pressure was important. So some metrics that were proposed originally can discriminate between unsafe swallowing, like in aspiration, or in ineffective swallows, as in residue. The study showed that the prognostic value of individual core metrics was only moderate for safety and efficacy. And if we look at the predictors, it was most of the time the vilopharyngeal contractile integral, the mesopharyngeal contractile integral, and the hypopharyngeal peak pressure that were the most predictive to aspiration and residue. So what does it mean? These results show that maybe regional pharyngeal pressure metrics should be reported and interpreted, and that may be more useful than an overall metric if your aim is to relate pressure with dysphagia symptoms. And for the hypopharynx, which contracts very brief and monomodal, it might be important to focus on peak pressures. Now, if we continue our validation process and look at UES metrics in dysphagic patients, that is a different story, because there you can see that almost all of the metrics are really differentiating controls from patients, and even in their different ages. And this is what you see on this slide. This is the intrabolus pressure. This is the IRP for relaxation of the upper sphincter, and this is the opening of the upper sphincter. And this is a comparison between controls and patients. And here you can see the controls spread out over different age group, and these are the patients. And as you can see, these metrics differed according to age. Now, one of the other parameters that was added into the core metrics is the intrabolus pressure in the hypopharynx, a metric that has been rigorously difficult to measure in the past. It's a marker for pressurization, for increased pressure, and it's evidence for resistance of obstructions to bolus flow across the upper esophageal sphincter. You measure this pressurization by the intrabolus pressure metric, and it's basically the pressure in the bolus during swallowing. But you need two techniques to confirm it. You do need bolus presence, and either you can, to be accurate, confirm it with radiology or with impedance. And at the same time, you need to have a pressure recording. And this is what we do with the HRM. So on the slide here, the impedance can show you where the opening and the bolus flow is. And here you can see the relaxation and the pressure during the swallow. Now, if we bring the same scheme to a high resolution plot, schematic, this is the upper esophageal sphincter, its relaxation and the post-contraction UES. This is the velopharynx, the mesopharynx, and the hypopharynx. And this is an example of a normal swallow. So, but in some cases, and one of the first intrabolus patterns that was very striking is a transient and short time, short intrabolus pressure of short duration, which is here schematically indicated like this. And what it basically means is that the UES relaxation as we know it, so on this plot, this is the color plot that you see. This is the intrabolus pressure measured above the upper sphincter, and this is the upper sphincter itself, where you can see the bolus flow on the impedance in purple. So this is where the bolus is, and the UES pressure in black. So you can see that the sphincter relaxes under the dotted line where the cutoff is, but at some point it increases again and is not relaxing anymore. This is a 50%. At that time, you can see that the intrabolus pressure just above it is increasing. And at that time, you can see the bolus flow. So this mark here, the 20 millimeter threshold line, indicates that the intrabolus pressure is high enough to be relevant. And this coordination shows basically, or incoordination may be the cause or genesis of transient pressurization patterns. So this was the first one that we recognized because it showed and told us something about bolus flow in the pharynx and across the sphincter. So if you have no pressurization, this is how it looks, but we recognized three major types, and you may think another deviation into pressurization patterns, but it is crucial to understand in the pharynx because it leads to symptomatology, which I will explain to you in a minute. The first type is pan-pressurization. It means that it's across the pharynx, that the upper esophageal sphincter is not opening, and that the pressure is captured between the velopharynx and the upper esophageal sphincter. This is the schematic view. This is the color plot. And as you can see here, the pressure is above and it stays above the cutoff of 20 millimeter. Distal pressurization, and very important here, you have no or not much pharyngeal contractility. In the second type, you do have increased intrabolus pressure across the pharynx based on a non-opening sphincter and the velopharynx, but there still is some contractility. There is contractility in the pharynx, and the transient pattern has a specific pattern as the sphincter is closed for a while and then opens and relaxes, and thereby the intrabolus pressure drops. Now, why is this important? It is important, and we checked it whether these patterns would be easy to be recognized. And as you can see here, in a study that we performed, it was an excellent inter-rater reliability if you can use the cutoff and take the cutoff of 20 millimeters of mercury. But why is this so relevant? Because, as I said, intrabolus pressure indicates a lack of bolus flow. This may indicate residue and swallowed and dysphagia symptoms. So if we compare the relation or the proportion of patients with a normal IBP, then we see that 77% of the patients do not have an abnormal UES, but 25% do. And on the other hand, if you have a high EBP, so if you see these patterns, 66% of these patients had an abnormal UVS. So this is worrisome, and this is where we think that this is a visual aid to use in terms of predicting whether the UVS and pharynx is abnormal. This was not enough, of course, so we checked it per type. So, for example, the band pressurization type, where there is constant panesophageal pressurization with a non-opening sphincter, 82% of these patients had intrabolus patterns and a too high UVS relaxation, IRP. If we look at the distal ones, where there is contractility but non-opening, you can see that's in 76%, and transient is in 1/3 of the patients. Even in the patients with a no pressurization, still 9% has an IRP that is too high, so a UVS dysfunction. So we've used and applied this type of pressurization pattern to a large group of patients where we had high resolution manometry impedance in, and what we saw, and we classified it as follows. So patients who had a type 1 pressurization, we classified them immediately as a UVS disorder. Those with type 2 of type 3, they either had an incomplete UVS relaxation or a normal UVS relaxation. If they had an incomplete relaxation, they were also called a UVS disorder. But if they had a normal UVS relaxation, but they had impaired opening or distensibility, they would also classify as a UVS disorder. In the patients who had no pressurization pattern, it could still be that they had an incomplete UVS relaxation and impaired dispensability. So this group, this first group, based on intrabolus pressure patterning, can lead to, or can be a first step in classifying the UVS disorders. If none of the above of these combinations is actually applying, it may well be that you have a patient with only a weak or absent contractility in the pharynx, and that would make it a propulsive disorder. If you have all normal findings, then of course you have no disorder, but there is a group that we still don't understand. Other findings and another disorder, and that's what we still need to work on. And as John and Peter has always said, for the esophagus, this is the work in progress. Well, this is definitely also a large work in progress. But what is important here is that this is a scheme that uses selected patterns and metrics. But these are taken into account only those that are best able to discriminate patients from healthy controls. Does it make sense or not? How does it link with the clinic? What we found was that this is the penetration aspiration score. 6 to 8 means aspiration indicated in red. And as you can see, the propulsive disorders and UVS disorders are the patients with the highest aspiration risk, but they're quite similar. So if it's a propulsive or a UVS disorder, the risk for aspiration is quite similar, and the same thing for penetration and aspiration. But if we compare that to other outcome measures like the clinical observation, clinical assessment, or the residue, there we slightly see a difference in the sense that, for example, the Sydney Swallow questionnaire, and you will see that Michael Szczesniak is going to tell you more about it this week as well. So they link with dysphagia outcomes. Also interested was that we ranked the pathology and towards those with an UVS disorder that was most common, and then we were looking at patients with osteophytes, focal fold palsy, presbyphagia, stroke, Zenker, and Parkinson's, and the one with the least, the group pathology with the least UVS disorder, with the patients with sleep apnea, globus, and myopathy. finally, we tried to look at pharyngeal contractility patterns because, as I said, we looked at regions, we looked at multiple combinations of regions and number of regions affected. But even if we just take an overall measurement in the sense that we use the contractile integral for the velopharynx and mesopharynx, and the peak pressure for the lower limit for the hypopharynx. If you see this scheme, and this is the PAS score, a residue in the piriform sinus in the valleculae and clinical assessment. If we start with aspiration, what you see, if we have a normal UVS, as you can see here, a normal UVS, as you can see here, there we always have a difference when the pharynx is contracting abnormally. So if the pharynx is abnormal, you will see a difference towards a normal pharynx, and that has an effect on aspiration, on residue, and on clinical outcome. But if your UVS is not normal, then it is only when the pharynx is also failing that you have an impact on aspiration, and that does not have an impact on the piriform sinus and on the clinical presentation. So this is important to know, but further to explore and to be confirmed. So if I may conclude and give some suggestions, I think the current pharyngeal HRM diagnostics that we have can quantify the physiological processes that drive the pathology that you see on radiology and FEE. So they're really nicely complementary. It is implemented in clinical care. It's used in bedside evaluation and in many hands, and thank God a lot of people are starting to use it. It has its value in decision-making, evaluation and follow-up of dysphagia management. If we talk about and look back at the protocol, I think it's an important message to use it and to maybe include natural swallows. In terms of the HRM metrics, please also use them and report them in your research and in your clinic, and link it to dysphagia outcomes. The more information and literature we have, the better we can sort out what is useful for our patients or not. As said, there were some core metrics that discriminate between unsafe or ineffective swallowing, but individual core metrics, their diagnostic performance is only moderate. I think a normal threshold or abnormal threshold is different from a symptomatic threshold, so I think that's what we need to work towards in cutoff values for symptom generation, not only for abnormality or normality. And if there is some evidence for a UVS disorder, I think it's very useful to have a look at the type of pharyngeal pressurization, or vice versa. If you see pharyngeal pressurization, it's important to have a look at the function of the upper esophageal sphincter. In clinical use, we still have a lot of work, and I hope in the future we will be able to work worldwide together to address the scope of practice, to the access, to improve the access, the clinical workflow and reimbursement, not only in our clinics or institutions, but also at the professional level. And in terms of the classification, I think there's still a lot of work to do, definitely because the role of the pharyngeal patterns and its combination with bolus flow need to be further clarified. And then finally, I think if we want to make a scheme leading to UVS and pharyngeal classification, it will need to be multimodal. I think we need to combine pharyngeal pressurization, opening, relaxation of the UVS, and also pharyngeal contractility and bolus flow. If we want to really make a difference and really want to classify them, it's too complex and it needs a lot of complicated combinations of factors. So as said, it's a work in progress, and I hope you will have learned something and that you have a wonderful rest of the session, and I am looking forward to hear some feedback from you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ashley O'Rourke from Medical University of South Carolina. Nice to see you. This is amazing work, and I applaud both you and Nathalie for really trying to bring this from the research to the clinical perspective. And so my question is, from a surgical standpoint, where we're evaluating these patients for possible surgery, it's probably not able to go back to the classification scheme, but the pan pressurization in your type 1, where there's no pharyngeal contractility, but there is pan pressurization, and then that's classified as a UES dysfunction because the UES isn't opening. Can you explain that a little bit more about how that's not like a type 2 achalasia analogy in the esophagus where there is just residue, and that's why we have pan pressurization, because we have no pharyngeal contractility per se there. And so therefore, clinically, bringing that one step forward, I would not address the UES immediately. I would address pharyngeal contractility. And so it's a dichotomy there of going through, thinking of it in the clinic, how do I treat those patients?
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing because, the pharyngeal so-called type 1 is, it's a type 2. That would be, I guess the corollary of a type 2 achalasia. But it's, to my mind, what's being shown there is passive distension of the pharynx to levels that are quite abnormal. So biomechanically, my interpretation is an outflow obstruction. So it's just bolus trapped between the velopharynx and the closed upper sphincter. Well, closed or mostly, closed upper sphincter. So I can't see that pattern happening any other way. And in fact, we never see that in healthy people. We've never seen, even in 94-year-olds.
Couldn't it just be absence of a triggered swallow? So you get kind of the volitional aspects of pressurizing and no pharyngeal swallow.
But you see you often see some relaxation or you might see it before the pressurization, and you see a post-pressurization sort of burst of activity suggests that the UES is being activated. So I can't interpret it as a swallow not being, yes, but in that context, I don't know. The velopharynx is activated as well. Doesn't.
But you can do
hard
that
to not. I don't see
too,
that it's. But to be fair, I must admit I haven't looked at enough cases on fluoroscopy with manometry to really see what's going on. But it seems to me, look, a type 2 achalasia, so, it's you've got pressurization, the UES activates, the EGJ is not opening, and you get this period of pressurization. So anyway, that's our interpretation. Happy to be corrected.
It'd be interesting to look at the hyolaryngeal mechanics, and maybe that's the predominant portion. Decreased pharyngeal contractility, decreased hyolaryngeal mechanics. So you get that UES, you don't get the drive to open the UES, you don't get the elevation and anterior excursion of UES opening, and so that's the UES problem, but it's primarily because of pharyngeal dysfunction.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'd love to sit.
We'll
and chat
agree
with
to
you
disagree, and
we'll geek out about it later.
Look forward to the paper that describes the biomechanics. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? So in the back, Ronaldo. Identify yourself, Ronaldo. Yeah.
Renato Salvador, University of Padua. Thank you, really. I really enjoyed the session. Your opinion about the striated muscle. Do you think it can have a role in the function of the US, because we saw a lot of data about US relaxation, all the data upstairs. But in my mind, I'm a surgeon, so I'm thinking that if we have something downstairs that maybe can have a high pressure zone or can have a really dysfunction of the muscle, everything is upstairs can have an effect of this functioning that I have above. So, do you think I can have can have a rule the striated muscle in the function of US and of course of all the oropharyngeal functioning?
You mean the proximal esophagus?
Yeah, exactly, in the proximal.
Yes. Well, in many of these patients, they don't actually have proximal contraction, but undoubtedly it is relevant I mean, I guess there are multiple ways where what's happening in the proximal esophagus can be relevant to the oropharynx. So I guess rather than spend the next 5 minutes trying to explore those things, I can perhaps accept that you're correct, and that certainly it's something that we do measure as a routine. But in terms of how it fits with this scheme, that's unexplored.
Thank you.
So, thank you for Taher for standing in at the last